If you've spent even a few weeks building UIs, you've heard the advice, less is more. Good design is less design. Simplify your design. You hear it so often that it starts sounding like an absolute law, and it kind of is, but it's not what it sounds like. When we first started, we learned all sorts of design techniques, and we wanted to impress other designers and developers, because of course we did. So we were like, look at this shadow I added. I can do a gradient instead of a solid color, or a subtle animation on hover. It felt productive. Adding felt like progress because our brains go, more effort means better design. But we didn't have any experience, which means we hadn't developed good taste yet. So the more we added, the worse our designs got. This is why junior designers are told to remove things. It's good advice. It's great advice, to be honest, not because fewer elements automatically create a better design, but because removing forces you to ask better questions. It forces you to think like a designer. Does this element add any value, or is it just a distraction? Do we really need 3 colors here, or can spacing solve the problem instead? So in short, if you have fewer elements to get wrong, your design will be better than if you were to let loose and add stuff left and right. Hence the famous advice, less is more. But over the last few years, less is more stopped being about usability. It became a visual trend. People started associating good design with lots of white space. No borders, no context, no color, and no character. Everything looked premium and soulless at the same time, and it's about time we fixed that. First of all, stop thinking in terms of less or more. Sometimes we want a lot of information, sliders, checkboxes, inputs, to make an informed decision. Other times, we don't want to see anything except a single button that says next, cancel, or done. Second, less stuff doesn't mean simple, and more stuff doesn't mean confusing. Simplicity and ease of use have nothing to do with how many elements are on the screen. And third, choosing between less or more design isn't a black and white decision. Sometimes you need to delight the user with a rich, expressive UI. And sometimes you need to keep things basic or boring on purpose. Now, let's look at some practical examples to show what I actually mean. Say you have 3 tabs like this, one for coding, one for the terminal, and one for the preview. You can't get any more basic than this. It looks simple, clean, and very minimal. And it works, but that doesn't mean it can't get better. For instance, we can group the code and terminal together to show they're closely related, while the preview is a separate thing. Then, maybe add icons to make things more obvious. We can add a container around the selected tab to really show that it's active, and add a cool gliding animation when you switch tabs. I've also added some highlights and shadows to add elevation and depth to the design. I actually have a whole video on how you can use depth to fix boring UIs, but if you compare the basic design to this one, you'll notice that adding more can actually help users, and make the UI a lot more delightful to look at. We can take this even further by introducing a gradient. Here's another example, and this one is tricky. Can you tell which design is simpler? The one on the left is as basic as it gets. It's just plain white text with no styling whatsoever. It does use a clean font that keeps it a bit more modern than a traditional serif font on a dated site, but it's as simple and minimal as you can get. Yet, you'd never choose it over the one on the right, even though the one on the right is objectively more design. It has different font styles and 4 colors, and it still feels simpler to use than the one on the left. That's because of hierarchy. One thing is bold, one thing is colored, and everything else is a bit muted. So, your eye gets a clear place to land first. Same thing here. This dashboard section might feel clean and minimal, but reading tables of numbers is just too much for most of us. That's why pro designers always add tooltips, axes, and context to charts. The left one is easy to design, but the right one is easy to use. Now let's talk about context. For the sake of clean and simple design, designers started hiding actually useful information. Say you're searching a documentation site for rate limit, and you get a list of titles with nothing else. A bare title forces you to open 3 different tabs just to find the right page. But if you show a snippet preview, the user gets enough context to pick the correct option the first time, and adding breadcrumbs can make things even easier to follow. Speaking of easy, showing 0 results found for a simple typo is just lazy design. Offer some kind of suggested result so the user doesn't have to retype, or worse, leave your site. So don't just think in terms of less or more. Think about how you can help the user at this exact moment. But if that sounds like too much work, you can try Mobbin, the sponsor of today's video. Mobbin has hundreds of thousands of real screens from all kinds of apps and websites. So instead of designing something from scratch, you can just take inspiration from it. What's great is how easy it is to search. You can browse by category, individual screens, specific UI elements, or entire user flows. Looking at these top-tier apps will show you that great UIs might look simple, but there's a lot of detail and effort behind them. You can get super specific and find tons of design ideas for your exact use case. Plus, Mobin also has its own MCP server, so your AI agent can just search and fetch these patterns for you directly. You can even see full step-by-step user journeys like onboarding, checkout, and search flows, or copy components straight into Figma to speed up your workflow. It saves you dozens of hours of trial and error, so definitely give it a try. Sometimes, less design is actually bad design. Take a brand new account with 0 invoices sent. Showing a blank screen that says no data might be accurate, but it's completely unhelpful. In this case, less is bad and more is good. You need to give users clear direction on how to move forward. It's the same thing with loading states. A 3-second bank sync feels like forever in silence, so naming the exact step buys you patience. Showing actual progress instead of a generic spinning wheel shows real momentum. Now, let me show you an example of where less design actually makes things harder to understand and overwhelming to look at. It's pretty common to find a wall of text on modern websites. At first glance, you might think it is what it is. Some designs just have to be busy because of all the information the user needs at once. But that doesn't mean we can't do a little typography magic to improve the experience. So first, make everything the same font style. Now that everything is a bit muted and nothing is screaming at you, we can pause and think like a user. Okay, so what's the first thing I need? I think the airline, the flight number, and the passenger name have to be at the top. Let's start with these 3 and work our way through the rest. We can drop the labels since they don't add anything meaningful, and maybe use the logo instead. It feels cleaner and still gives the exact same information. Then we can bring these 3 to the top row, and we can unmute them by giving them a lighter color for better contrast. Next, we have these 4 label value pairs. Again, we can drop the labels and just do this. The full city name isn't as important, so we can emphasize the city codes instead. Maybe add an airplane icon to give it some character. As for these last 2 pairs, they aren't as critical, so they can just go right down here. The seat number and PNR are really important, so we need to emphasize them a little and rearrange them like this. The boarding time and flight status can follow the exact same style to keep the design clean and consistent. We can also color code the flight status. People are already used to seeing that in real life at airports and other transportation hubs. And in the end, just bring everything together while maintaining proper spacing. This ensures the card is made up of separate pockets of information, rather than a giant dump of text. Now, compare this to where we started. Take a screenshot, show it to someone, and ask them which one is easier to read. By the way, I have dedicated videos on typography and spacing if you want to go into greater detail. But for now, we can further improve the design by getting rid of the border and bringing some depth into the scene. Adding a subtle gradient will also complement our highlights really well. If this still feels a bit bland or too gray, we can absolutely play with different colors depending on the brand. I'm just tweaking the hue while keeping the exact same lightness value. Again, watch my video on colors and depth if you want to go into greater detail. So whenever you have a wall of text, emphasize the most important elements and group similar items together to guide the user's eyes. This technique works with all kinds of information, and it works without fail. The point I am trying to make is that less design doesn't automatically mean a simple or easy UI. You have to put in some effort to make certain elements pop, both for the sake of visual hierarchy, and so the UI doesn't feel dead or boring to look at.